Philippians chapter 1. Allan and I, a while back, it was about a year ago probably, we started talking in 2024 early on about doing a series of lessons together like this. And, well, it didn't happen in 2024, but it is happening in 2025. And we're just going to do 4 of these lessons. So if you would read along with us for the next 4 weeks in Philippians chapter 1, 2, 3, and 4. That's today and the next 3 weeks. We chose this because, well, we thought that it would be a really good study for us to do together, and also it fit really nicely into our schedules. So we've got 4 lessons together. Hope this is going to be a blessing today. I'm going to ask a few questions. We're going to go back and forth and answer some questions together. One thing that we had talked about on Friday when we got together to talk more about this was if you have questions that you would like to have answered from Philippians, then all you really need to do is just ask me or Allan, and we'll add that to our list of questions that we want to answer. And so please feel free to ask those questions, after our lessons, and we'll be glad to share our thoughts in upcoming lessons. I want to read one thing, and then I'm going to ask a question, and Allan's going to take it from there. We'll see how that goes. I want to read with you beginning in Philippians 1, verse 21 and following. It says, "For to me, to live is Christ, and to die is gain. But if I am to live on in the flesh, this will mean fruitful labor for me, and I do not know which to choose. But I am hard-pressed from both directions, having the desire to depart and be with Christ, for that is very much better. Yet to remain on in the flesh is more necessary for your sake. Convicted of this, I know that I will remain and continue with you all for your progress and joy in the faith, so that your proud confidence in me may abound in Christ Jesus through my coming to you again. Only conduct yourselves in a manner worthy of the gospel of Christ, so that whether I come and see you or remain absent, I will hear of you that you are standing firm in one spirit, with one mind, striving together for the faith of the gospel, in no way alarmed by your opponents, which is a sign of destruction for them, but of salvation for you, and that too from God. For to you it has been granted for Christ's sake not only to believe in him, but to also suffer for his sake, experiencing the same conflict which you saw in me and now hear in me." So as you begin a study like this, one of the more important questions that we have to ask is, what's the background? What's happening here? Why is Paul writing this? Who is he writing it to? Are there some issues going on that he's trying to resolve? And so I'm going to let Allan take that first question there. What's the background and content of the Philippians letter?
So if we're just reading inside the book of Philippians, you see verse 13, Paul talks about imprisonment. Verse 17, he also talks about imprisonment. And he also mentions in verse 13 the Praetorian Guard. So the Praetorian Guard, or it could just be talking about the palace, like not specifically the soldiers themselves, but everybody that's in the palace. It gives you a Roman feeling, right? So whether that be, some people have the opinion that maybe Paul was at this point imprisoned in Caesarea because there was a praetorium there. Or maybe he was in Ephesus, or maybe he was in Rome. I tend to think he was in Rome. If you look at the other options, Ephesus would be the earliest, maybe about just 3 or 4 years maybe after the church in Philippi was started. If he was in Caesarea, it might be about 5 years after, 7 years. If he's in Rome, it's probably about 10 years after the church in Philippi was started, and about 30 years after Jesus was crucified on the cross. So you see a couple things. For example, at the end of chapter 1, where Sam just read, he mentions suffering in verse 29. So the Philippians, there's probably some suffering happening there with them. Chapter 3, verse 1 and following, he talks about some enemies that maybe they have. And then when you look again at the end of the book of Philippians chapter 4, verse 22, this is one of the reasons I think it's probably in Rome, is he mentions that there's some Christians in Caesar's household that are also sending greetings. And so I tend to think that Caesar is in Rome, and so that's probably where we're at. So Paul is one way or another, whatever's happening, wherever he's imprisoned, he is imprisoned. right? He is not where he wants to be. It is very probable, as you read through the text, that what Paul is doing is he's been preaching the gospel, and because he's preaching the gospel, he is now being persecuted because of his faith, and that's why he's stuck in prison. If you want to just kind of think about this idea about being persecuted for your faith, there's probably some other examples throughout the Bible that where other people. Do you want to take that one?
No, I thought. Okay.
I can do it too.
Well, obviously he's from prison, right? So wherever he's speaking from right now, it's actually clear that he's in prison. Not a desirable place to be. And when we were talking about this the other day, we talked about a few other people in the Bible that were also in undesirable places. We talked about Job for a few minutes and how Job he wasn't in a prison, but he was kind of in a prison, right? Not in a physical sense, but he lost his family, he lost his wealth, he lost his health. All these things were taken away from him. And you see that not only were these things taken away, but after they were taken away, what did Job do? He remained faithful to God, and he was restored. We talked about, I said Shem, Him, and Japheth, but I meant Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that they were in the fiery furnace, right? And that God was with them in that place. They were in an undesirable place, and yet, what did we see about their story? They were faithful. Would you bring up Joseph? I think you brought up Joseph the other day. Here, Joseph, he's sold into slavery because of the jealousy of his brothers. He's taken and put into a pit, sold into slavery. And next thing you know, he's in someone's house, and God is using him in that house. And then some things happen where he's taken and kicked out of the house and put in prison. And if you read that story, you will see that Joseph thinks of that, and the narrator says that Joseph understood this, that God meant it for what? Do you remember? God meant it for good, right? He could still see that God was at work in this, right? And so, there were lots of those stories that you could see in the Bible. Daniel is another example of that. The persecution of the prophets. You'd see that these are men or examples of faith where they were clearly in undesirable circumstances. And even though they were in those circumstances, somehow they managed to remain faithful to God through those circumstances. And what you see is consistency between what they believed to be true about God and how they behaved during these moments of persecution. And so, Paul, I think, is in a very similar situation. Here he is, he's in chains, he's in prison, not a desirable place. And at the same time, he's saying things like, well, don't worry about me. In fact, it's turned out for the better. Like I don't know if anybody's ever gone to prison before and thought, oh yeah, this is so much better. This is so good. But what was good was that Christ was being exalted through him. That he was being able to share the gospel with people. At one point in the prison epistles, he says, because they're chained to me, like they can't get away. Kind of like you today, if this goes a little long. I'm going to point you out if you try to run. But in all seriousness, Paul is not just enduring prison. He's seeing it as an opportunity to exalt Christ, to demonstrate faith, to be an example of what it is to bring what you believe to be true into in a consistent way with what you are doing in terms of your behavior, which we'll get to towards the end of the lesson here. So the question that we were wrestling with, we spent an hour and a half or so at Caribou Coffee. And so at the end of our conversation, as we were wrapping up, I want you to know something. Sometimes talking about your faith in a public place, you might have some people that give you some opposition, but that's not what happened to us. In fact, at the end of our conversation, actually it started out with a lot of people in there, and everybody left except two people and us. Maybe we should have paid attention to that. But there were two people left, and the one guy that was sitting next to us, he came up and he said that he is studying in an MDiv, a Master of Divinity program, to go into ministry. And another guy, the only other guy there, came over and he says, I planted a church in Johnston Corner, something like that up north there. So all that was left in the room was just two other people of faith, but they were paying attention to our conversation. I think it's okay to talk about your faith in public. In fact, I encourage it. Anyway, so how do people of faith then endure difficult circumstances? And I'm going to let Allan take the point on that there. How do we deal with difficult circumstances in a way that honors God?
Before going right into that, I wanted to mention, you've said multiple times difficult circumstances. Mm-hmm. We talked about circumstances we don't want to be in. And the fact is, we have to acknowledge there are situations we don't want to be in, mm-hmm. right? We don't love suffering. Mm-hmm. I don't think anybody in the Bible just looks and says, hey, wow, this is so much fun to get beat. This is so much fun to be in prison. This is, I don't think anybody's saying that. Even when we take a verse like Romans 8:28, and people are like, oh, well, see, everything's good. God makes everything good, Well, it's not saying that every circumstance is good. It's saying that God can work through any circumstance to create good. One of those ultimate circumstances, of course, we already talked about Jesus on the cross, right? Was Jesus dying on the cross good? Okay, he suffered a whole lot for us, right? But it wasn't because he was enjoying being beaten and being abandoned and being hung on a cross, right? But God can use that terrible situation in order to create good. For us, it's really good, right? And I actually think, guys, that kind of goes into the question, right? Yep. How can we endure difficult circumstances? I think one is not by denying that it's bad, not by denying that it is a terrible circumstance. I was sitting with some people the other day, and one person who's been struggling a lot with his health, and another person was having some health issues, and he goes, well, nothing but what you've been struggling with. It's not a competition, right? People suffer. We all suffer. We all have different sufferings. Mine might be worse or less than yours, perceived, but it's still suffering. So I think by not denying that there is suffering, but what we see throughout the scriptures is the focus. There's a focus that happens through the suffering. Job, time and time again, just kept saying, God, I need to talk to you. God, I need to talk to you. God, I need to talk to you. Right? Every time he turned around, he was trying to figure out God, right? And that's what Paul's doing here too. His focus is completely on Jesus and on what Jesus has done for us. And I think that's the very base. There's a whole lot more things we can get into, but I think the very base is, where is our focus through the suffering? Are we focused on the suffering, or are we focused on God who can help us through the suffering? Because that'll make a difference on what our attitude is. That'll make a difference on how far we can go. One step forward, right? One more step. Just keep moving forward. Will depend on where our focus is. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I'll just add one thing to that. So the point about suffering, when someone has ever said to you something like this, well, I'm not suffering as much as you are, or something like Allan was saying there. And my response to that is always kind of like this illustration of, if I were to take Nick, for example, and I were to take and have a vise up here and crank his hand down in it, right? And just keep cranking it and cranking it. You know what a vise says? It pinches tightly, and to the point where he's just squirming in pain and so forth. And he said, Sam, this really hurts really bad, but not nearly as much as some other people who are suffering. The more I crank it down, how much more do you think his idea about that will change? Right? It's going to change, right? Because you're going to be like, okay, because at a certain point, the pain level gets to be like, yeah, it may not be as bad as other people, but it really hurts pretty bad right now, right here. And you really want to kind of be set free from that, right? That's pain is real. And for you to compare it to other people's pain doesn't make it less real. It's still real pain. Paul is in a real prison, and Roman prisons were not known for being the great place to hang out. It wasn't something that people aspired to. Like, you try to avoid those places. And yet Paul, because of his faith, is able to say some things. Like, for example, he says in this text, he says that to live is Christ and to die is to gain. But why? How could he say something like that, right? One, he's in prison, and dying would mean, well, he's not in prison anymore, right? So maybe there is a certain gain to that, but that's not what he has in mind. What he's saying is that if I get to live on in this condition or in any condition, my view of this life is greater than this circumstance that I am in right now, okay? He has, as he writes elsewhere, a peace that surpasses understanding, and that comes from having a view of life that is greater than the immediate circumstance or immediate suffering that he's going through. And I think that's how people of faith need to think. If this life is all that we have, then to live gives us an opportunity to serve Christ in this life, no matter how much the suffering might be or how difficult it is. And if we die, then we get to go and be with him. Like it's even better. And Paul even writes that. He says, it's even better for me. Like if I died and went to be with Christ, that's exactly what I want. Isn't that what we all want? I had a friend one time that says, yeah, I want that, but just not right now. Like, I really kind of wait a while. I got a few more things I'd like to do. And I said, actually, I think if we really knew what being with God is like, what being with Christ is like, there isn't anything on my to-do list in this world that would outweigh being in the presence of God for eternity with Christ. That's just but your view of life more broadly is going to impact the way that you encounter or deal with suffering immediately. Some of you are waiting for me to say the word eschatology, but I'm not going to say it. All right. So let's move this into the next little piece here that we just had a set of questions that we walked out of that with. What is the benefit of enduring difficult circumstances? What's the benefit of suffering? What is the benefit of that? Allan, I'll let you roll with that one for a minute.
Well, to go back to focus and everything, obviously if we're thinking about the suffering, we tend to think this isn't any fun and that there is no benefit, right? Mm-hmm. We tend to think, I don't want to be here. I'd rather be out of this situation. Again, none of us really says, hey, you know what? I'd like to go suffer for a little bit. Mm-hmm. You know, yeah. Can I have about 5 years of bad health, or or whatever? No one asked for that, but as we try to guess through and we try to think about these things, well, one is as we go through the scriptures, I do think again focus. Right? One of the things about the suffering that we realize this life is not everything that we want it to be, right? There's something else that we're looking forward to. There's something else that where God, Revelation uses the phrasing of no more tears, no more death, no more suffering, right? Doesn't that sound good? And when we go back to that thinking about how do we get that? How do we get that, right? When we're comfortable in what we're doing, it's pretty easy to get stuck on me, right? And how much I enjoy my situation. And this is what Satan told God in the Job situation, right? Well, of course, you blessed him. Of course he's going to serve you. But there's something about being in situations that we don't like that we do have to look outside of ourselves and we have to look to God. And I actually think that's probably one of the reasons why God allows that to happen, right, is so that we can look to him and that we can figure out where is our faith. 1 Peter 3 also, where's the other place? Jude, maybe? Can't be right. Talks about suffering and how our attitude towards suffering. It's James 1.
James, yeah.
And it talks about the fact that we should count it joy, right? We should count it joy when we suffer because it's testing our faith. It's like gold going through the fire, getting rid of the impurities. And so the idea that we can prove what our actual character is, and we can grow in character, and we can grow in patience, and we can grow in joy, and we can grow in our faith when we're focused more on God instead of on ourselves.
Yeah, right. Just another little point on that. It sort of depends on why we are suffering. Like if I have a needless amount of suffering that doesn't produce anything, I don't think I want that, right? So was it on New Year's Eve morning, I went to visit my dentist because I had an abscessed tooth right back here. I'm going to have a root canal on the 14th. Isn't that fun? Not fun. 13 Monday, whatever, a week from tomorrow. I am not looking forward to that. But the pain got to the point that it was just absolutely excruciating to where I couldn't think of anything else. I felt like something was trying to get out of the left side of my head. It was terrible. I was not suffering for my faith, right? I was suffering because I had a physical infirmity, something that was hurting me. Doesn't mean that I shouldn't have been faithful through that experience, right? But it wasn't producing for me, faithful endurance. I was just like, okay, I want some Motrin. I want something to get rid of this pain. This is hurting too bad. And so, there's needless suffering, right? That doesn't really produce anything. But suffering for a particular cause does produce something, right? And James says it produces endurance, right? And even in this text here, if you'll read it with me, it's just before we start reading verse 20. Paul makes this point. He says that he would not be put to shame in anything, but that with all boldness, Christ will even now as always be, what's your Bible say? Exalted, right? Part of suffering is teaching me endurance, right, for my faith. Part of suffering is actually refining me, like Allan said. But also part of it is exalting Jesus. That through my faithful suffering because of the preaching of the gospel, this proclamation of the death and the burial and the resurrection of Jesus, somehow through that, my faithfulness, no matter what the consequences are to me personally, is a means of exalting and lifting up Christ. Which he's going to come back to in the next chapter, because he's going to talk about Jesus and his crucifixion, how he humbled himself to the point of even death on a cross. But what did God do in response to that? Through that suffering, he was brought low, and also he was exalted to have the name that is above every name. That the name of Jesus, every tongue would confess and every knee would bow. So there's a lesson in there for us about being faithful for the right reasons, for the advancement of the gospel and obedience to what Christ has sent us to do, where Christ is exalted, where he's lifted up because of that. And I think that people throughout my life who have suffered well, who have endured difficult circumstances, have taught me something about their faith and their reliance upon Christ. He's exalted through those things.
I'm gonna ask a question for a moment.
Okay.
You said needless suffering. So if you go back to Job, from Job's point of view,
well, meaningless suffering is probably what I meant.
Did he need to suffer? Like, did he think, oh wow, this is good suffering? You know, I mean, having all your possessions stolen. You know, I mean, go back to Joseph. You know, being sold into slavery by his brothers. You know, was that meaningful suffering? I think the idea is that suffering is suffering, and sometimes it is very pointed and very specific because someone didn't like the fact that we were Christians. Someone didn't like the fact that we're talking about God and we're sharing Jesus. But sometimes it's just a byproduct of the fact that we live in this world that's fallen. And I think the attitude is the same. I think the key is the same throughout the scriptures. The idea is that even if it's a small amount of suffering, well, my reaction during a small amount of suffering is going to impact my attitude towards a lot more suffering, right? So maybe all the little sufferings maybe helps me to realize, even, like a tooth or whatever, maybe that's supposed to help me focus on God more. Maybe that's supposed to help me say, hey, God, thanks when my health is good, and hey, God, thanks when my health is bad, but can you please take this away from me? And maybe it goes back to that praying in all times, and without ceasing, is that maybe it's those little things that are supposed to help us to learn for the big times.
I think you're right. I think all suffering has some benefit. I'll let you know in a couple weeks after the root canal whether I'm thankful or not for it. I have a feeling I may not be very thankful. No, you're right. I mean, obviously we can, there's meaningless suffering. What I meant by that was to say that it wasn't directly related to me being persecuted for my faith. And really, that's what Paul is dealing with. Why is he in prison? Well, because he wouldn't stop. He kept boldly proclaiming the gospel. And as a result of that, he underwent some suffering. And by the way, we'll get to this a little bit later. That suffering motif comes up a little bit later in this study as well. And it's important. I mean, Paul says in Colossians chapter 1 that he is filling up that which is lacking in Christ's afflictions. Like he is carrying on with the suffering that Christ actually had in his life. And when he died and when he was resurrected and went on to be with the Father in heaven and prepare a place for us, what happened? Did all the suffering stop? No, but the people he has sent in his place are now undergoing suffering as a result of that. We're going to talk about what that means, that suffering. I don't know that we understand that as well as we should, but we're going to get to that in a future lesson. Okay, so let's kind of get to this last question here. What does it mean to conduct yourselves in a manner worthy of the gospel? And I want to break that into two questions. I'm going to talk about the first part of that, about what is the gospel, what does he mean by gospel, and then what does he mean by worthiness, and I'll let Allan roll with that part of it. What is the gospel, right? If you're going to conduct yourself in a manner that's worthy of the gospel, what could that possibly mean? Well, Paul's not vague about what he means by the gospel. In fact, he says in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, first 4 verses, he talks about this gospel in which we now stand. Okay, and he gives us this image of, like, if the gospel was this room or this place or this ecosystem around us, that we stand in that gospel. And that gospel is, in his summary there in the first 4 verses, the death of Jesus, the burial of Jesus, and the resurrection of Jesus. This is the good news message. This is the core element of the gospel: a death, a burial, and a resurrection. And when Paul talks about that in other places, like in Romans chapter 6, he talks about our baptism. And in our baptism, he's connecting that by saying, hey, it's not okay for you to go on living in sin. You should turn away from sin. If you understand what God's grace really is, you won't desire to do more of it. You will want to stop sinning. And then he'll say, don't you know that those of you who have been baptized, right? I'd like to say this at this point. There is no such thing in the Bible as an unbaptized believer. Paul can say, don't you know that you've been baptized? He speaks to everyone's common experience by saying that. He says that you were buried in water, right? You were raised to newness of life. A death, a burial, and a resurrection represents our response to the good news, to the gospel, which is a death, a burial, and a resurrection. And so when he says to conduct yourself in a manner that's worthy of the gospel, I think he's saying something like you should conduct your life should be a reflection of what you believe to be true about the death and the burial and the resurrection of Jesus. That should condition the way that you live, the way that you behave. Now,
so obviously, if you believe certain things about the death, the burial, and the resurrection, then that should obviously change how you act in every circumstance. Christianity is not a reactive religion. It is a pre-active religion. The idea being that we are supposed to pre-decide how we're going to act. Now, do I always do that? No. Am I always good? I'm not always good at that, right? We all mess up. But the idea is that before something happens, we're supposed to be reading the text, and we're supposed to be realizing that, hey, you know what? We're supposed to love people. We're supposed to be patient with people. We're supposed to tolerate people, even when, tolerate gives the idea that I don't agree with them or they did something I didn't like, right? We're supposed to forgive people, right? We're supposed to be merciful, and so those are things that we're supposed to come up with beforehand. What most people do in the world is they say, "Oh, well, you hit me, and so now I'm going to hit you back," because that's a reaction, right? But if before someone hits me and I think, "Hey, well, what if someone were to hit me? How might Jesus react in that circumstance?" 1 Peter 2 says that he left us an example that we should follow in his footsteps. So if someone hits me, then I realize, well, Jesus would probably say, don't hit them back. Maybe he might say, turn the other cheek. Right? And if I have that in my mind, then someone hits me, and my first reaction might be, I want to hit you back, but I might realize, hey, I've already made a decision. I'm not going to hit you back. Right? And so this is where this idea is, a manner worthy of the gospel is to say, hey, what I'm doing is I'm focused on who Jesus is and who God is, and I'm trying to be more like Jesus. I like to think of it in the sense of saying we should think more like Jesus, we should speak more like Jesus, and we should act more like Jesus, right? Like everything that comes out of us should be more like Jesus. He's left us an example. That's the whole reason. As we read through the Gospels, as we even read through the whole Bible, and we see how God deals with people. But Jesus came and he lived Jesus was hungry. He was tired. He was abandoned by his friends. He was mistreated. And none of that is an excuse to misbehave. None of that is an excuse to say, well, but he hit me first. Right? And so this is where the idea goes back to is what we're doing is we're saying, I'm going to follow Jesus. I'm going to, what does he say in Luke 9? If anyone wishes to come after me, he must deny himself, take up his cross daily, and follow me.
Right. Yeah. Well, we're going to actually dig into this idea more as we go because Paul's not done with explaining. Like, he's just introducing this idea of how we are to live in a way that's consistent with what we believe. And that's kind of what the point is on the board up there behind me there, that we need to, how did I put it up there? Conduct yourselves in a manner. Well, that's what he did. In my notes, I wrote down that we should behave in a way that's consistent with what we believe. And to walk in a manner or to live in a manner that's worthy of the gospel, well, you have to ask yourself the question, what do I really believe? Do I believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God? That he died, that he was buried, that he was raised? And as a result of that, he has made me a new creation because of his grace. And because of that, he calls me to a particular way of living. As Allan said, to walk in the footsteps of Jesus, to respond to people not in kind, but to offer them kindness when they attack us. How is it that Paul can sit in prison and say to live as Christ and to die as gain? It's because he believes that he has been saved by this message of a death, a burial, and resurrection. And that can't be taken away from him. So when you face persecution, what are you afraid of? Shouldn't be anything to be afraid of. Because whatever we experience, how does Paul say it in Corinthians, is light and momentary affliction. It's just passing away when compared to the eternal weight of glory. He can see that this gospel message conditions the way he lives and the way that he endures and the way that he practices his faith. And what he wants to do, I think, is bring us to the point where we say that what we profess to be true about the gospel is also practiced in the way that we live. I know it's a little offensive to say it this way, but because at some level we're all hypocrites, but I'll say it this way anyway, that if you said to me, or if I said to you, hey, this is what I believe, and then you looked at my life and you said, Sam, I don't think that's what you believe. I think what you're doing is a result of what you actually believe. You can profess one thing, but what you practice says a lot about what you really believe. Does that make sense to you? And what I think Paul is doing is he's taking this gospel message and saying that you need to bring your life and your practice into consistency, into alignment with this good news message of a death and a burial and a resurrection. It should condition the way that you live in every single way. You can tell me what you believe. I'll look at your life and I'll say, actually, I think maybe what you do is telling me a lot more about what you actually believe. Allan moved.
Yeah,
he did this, so I know that means something.
But I don't want to interrupt you.
No. Go.
But okay, so I was thinking about saving this for later on. But like, there's some things that as you kind of look at, and you're just talking about like how I believe and how I react, and somebody's going to see different things, right? Well, hopefully they see the same thing, right? But if they see things that are different, then they're going to question if you really believe what you practice, right? So with Paul, here's the question, right? As Paul's talking about these things, he says, well, for me to die, is gain, to live as Christ, to die is gain. When he says, hey, you know what, my imprisonment is for the betterment of the gospel. He says, hey, you need to conduct yourself in a manner worthy. And so the question might be, well, Paul, can you show us? What are you talking about? Do you really think that? Here in the book of Philippians, we don't have, outside of what Paul's telling us, we don't know, what is Paul doing while he's imprisoned, right? So is it possible that he's chained between guards? Is it possible that he's in Rome, at the end of Acts, he's in a house, he's allowed to have visitors, but he is under house arrest, right? So there's questions about what his exact circumstances are. But Acts 16 gives us a very real example of Paul. And it just so happens to be in Philippi, right? So Paul in Acts 16 is preaching the gospel. He's baptized Lydia and her family in verses 13 to 15. Then the next few verses, there's this demon-possessed girl who's making lots of money for her people, and he leaves her alone. But she keeps bugging him and bugging him. So finally, he's like, you know what? He casts the demon out, right? And so now, because he casts the demon out, he's in trouble with her owners because she's not going to make them any more money. And so the owners take him to the authorities, and they end up making it happen so that he's beat and he's thrown in prison, right? So now Paul is in the middle of the dungeon, like he's in there. He is shackled, and he is shackled hands, feet, and it gives the impression that it may not be like this nice, easy, he's chilling back, but you'll see like in the medieval times when they have him on like the head and it's probably an uncomfortable situation, right? So we don't know what's exactly happening in the Philippian letter, but in Acts 16 in Philippi, Paul is there. He's imprisoned for his faith. And what's he doing? If you know the story, you know that what Paul and Silas are doing is that they're singing and they're praying. Now, what might you or I do? I'll tell you what I might do. Like I might would start thinking about how unfair it is for me to be in prison. How unfair it was for me to be beaten when I'm a Roman citizen and I shouldn't be here. Maybe I would have tried to get rid of that beating ahead of time. But his faith is telling him, you know what? I'm just going to praise God. I'm going to glorify God. And how do you think that affected the people around him? The rest of that story is very much because of him praying and singing at that time. And so I envision as Paul's writing this letter, and we talked about this the other day, what I think is if this is about 10 years maybe after that, what happened in Acts 16, I envision that jailer is probably a leader in the church. Maybe he's an elder in the church. He's been there. And he can say, you know what? Let me tell you about Paul. Let me tell you about what my experience with Paul is. And let me tell you about how I became a Christian. Right? And so when he talks about suffering, and that suffering being for the betterment of the gospel, that's huge. Mm-hmm. And he can say, he's not preaching one thing and doing something else. Like his actions are preaching the word.
Mm-hmm. We're done. A little bit later in Philippians, we're going to see this, and I think it's in chapter 4, when he talks about how he's learned to be content in every situation. Whether he has many things and everything or he has nothing, and he's demonstrating that. I think that's something that the gospel produces. Now, let's wrap this up. I ask you the question. So then, what are we supposed to learn from this? Right? Like we've been talking about these things here. What are we supposed to learn from this? And I hope that we can take away just at least one thing. I think there's a lot of things in this chapter that Paul is beginning as far as the conversation throughout Philippians is going to take us. But at least one thing that comes out of this is that conduct that is worthy of the gospel is a conduct that has brought together what you believe with what you practice. Those two things have to be brought into alignment with each other. Paul is modeling that for us. Christ modeled that for us. He'll be the biggest example next Sunday when we talk about chapter 2. But we have to learn as God's people that whatever circumstance we find ourselves in, we need to behave in a way that's consistent with what we believe. And Paul says that needs to be in a way that's worthy of the gospel, of the death, the burial, and the resurrection of Jesus. The question is, are you living in a manner that is worthy of the gospel?